Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the Beyond Solitaire podcast, my very special guest is Christina Kahrl. How you doing, Christina?
How do? Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, what exactly is it that you do right now?
I am a sports editor for ESPN.com. Used to be a Major League Baseball sports editor, and that's where I spend most of the last 25 years is working on Major League Baseball. But now I work on our nightly coverage of every sport that there is, and there are so many. But so whether it's college basketball, pro basketball, playoff football, baseball, you name it, women's basketball. I'm there for all of it for ESPN.
That is amazing. And it's even more amazing because you and I actually have a really similar educational background, including that we both went to that finest of universities, the University of Chicago. What did you study while you were there?
I studied modern European history sporadically when I wasn't dodging out to get to the ballpark, because, of course, one of the beautiful things, especially if you grew up on a ranch as I did, moving into a major city like Chicago, is that boom, there are ballparks right there. So going up and seeing the White Sox and the Cubs and skipping class to go watch baseball. I would have to confess I did more than I should have as in my first couple of years when I was a especially irresponsible undergraduate. But uh, I basically took it as my challenge that if the University of Chicago is supposed to be the most miserable place on earth, I was going to unprove that, and I was going to go have as much fun as I possibly could in a city like Chicago.
Scandal. How dare you? You don't sound like a Chicago student. No, joking. And then is that also where you got your master's?
No, I got my master's up on the north side at Loyola University Chicago, although at the time I was still living in Hyde Park for a stretch and then out in the western suburbs. But no, I got my master's in public history and history at Loyola when I was considering moving on into a PhD track and getting a doctorate in history. And then I decided that that was probably not a very good financial move for my future. I always like to joke that if I was going to want to teach people about the diet of worms, I was probably making a prediction about what I was going to be living on.
So you are so basically you like European history and around what era? What was your time period of choice?
I particularly liked the 19th century and the 18th century. I took, I loved revolutions. I loved periods of change. I loved, people reinventing ideas and coming up against the limitations of ideas. So, like, like an essay, like one of my favorite things just to have read was like, Turgot's on foundations and, like, so looking at the French encyclopedists of the 18th century, but also, and okay, I'm going to say I liked Marx and Engels. I liked, like Freud as an observer of historical events. I enjoyed Max Weber. Like the University of Chicago, you spend a lot of time reading the original source stuff. But the other thing that I minored in during my time at the U of C was um, classics or ancient history. So reading, and this is where we have a lot of crossover because I spent a lot of time doing coursework on Roman history, and got to take. Still one of my favorite classes of all time at any level was Rick Saller's course on Tacitus. And reading Tacitus as a historical source and learning that he is not, I mean, every fiction reader has that moment where they realize, like in some novels, where they realize that your narrator isn't being entirely honest with you. And when that coin drops and when you're reading Tacitus for the first time, where it's like, he's not on the level, is he? He's that's not right. That didn't it no. And when you figure that out about a historical source as an 18-year-old, like that's an important moment where you like, and maybe now in the world after X-Files, everybody learns to question everything or whatever. But dealing with that on that level with a historical source and understanding that even historical sources, you might put them in capital H history, but that they have their own agenda, and figuring that out with a source and figuring out where they're bending the truth to tell you the story they want you to hear is fascinating as an exercise, but then in terms of what it teaches you to what to look for in history and what to, like what other sources to consider and really where as a historian you're supposed to the real job as opposed to merely just recounting events.
Well, history is always two stories, right? You're reading the story of the history that you're studying, and then the person who's telling the history is also telling you a story about themselves and where they are, where they're coming from. And so you're
Exactly.
always getting something, a double narrative, which I love. So, how do you go from peak nerdiness, which I very much appreciate, to sports? No, I'm kidding. I like sports, but how do you get there? How does this happen?
Well, I mean, a lot of the things that you learn in history, or learn to value in terms of particularly from a multidisciplinary approach, all of that stuff has a place in sports in terms of you're not just talking about history, but you're also talking about economic history. You're talking about areas of public policy when you're talking about stadium construction. You're talking about things like race and gender when you're talking about integration of baseball in American society, where women get to play, particularly today, and like, the professionalization or the expansion of women's sports. Even the introduction of women's sports and how controversial that was in the 30s, for the Olympics. And all of that stuff is about people fundamentally, and that's what history is about. So sports is just an area where people are engaged, they care, they're invested in the outcomes, not just of the sports themselves, but out of their own personal interest, but because they also like to play. And so all of that kind of dovetails into it's history in the moment being made and then learning about how to tell those stories and what kind of tools you get to utilize to tell them. And so whether that's using data-driven journalism or whether that's using oral history and you're going back and looking at, people recounting like the way things were, whether you're doing, your own reportage and learning to use access in a way that makes a measurable difference in terms of like, on the one hand, you might have like the straight story from the Associated Press, but that bare bones detail skeleton of what happened at an event, at a game in a guy's career is not the full story. And so, as a historian, you want to look at it in even more detail or find a more interesting way to get into it and, like tell something that actually captures people's imaginations. So, sports, yeah, it isn't just my happy place, but it was also wound up being like a place where I found a career because way back in the go-go days of the 90s, in the invention of the internet, I was finding other people who were interested in sports and interested in quantitative analysis in sports, through the old Usenet discussion groups, and through that, launched kind of like a one of our what like effectively like one of the first like independent journalism projects, um, baseball prospectus. And so we started out, it was early enough, it was 1995 to 1996, it was early enough that we were thinking, oh, we'll use the internet as a way to promote the annual book we'll write. um, and it wasn't more than 6 months before we're like, okay, we wrote a book, but you know what? The internet is where we're going to be spending most of our time telling stories. And we're going to continue to do print products, but we're going to live on the net and we're going to live in digital media. And so making that decision in 1996, and really kind of creating a website when there weren't that many websites. How does your page render on Netscape? Like things like that. Way back. It's like it's been and then also very early on like figuring out that like this is important enough and good enough and their audience exists that we can create this, we can survive on a subscription model. um and this is 20 years before newspapers like thought, oh, we might want to charge for that. And it's like, if you want to stay in business, you do. Um, Content shouldn't. Everybody loves free content, but content shouldn't be free. People are doing this is for their careers and their lives, and they should be able to have a livelihood from it.
So, when you say quantitative analysis, what exactly does that mean? What does that consist of?
There are so many different flavors anymore because, again, have the number of tools have multiplied so that the level of granularity of what you can get into. I mean, we started out looking broad strokes at, like outcomes. So like, individual player performance on the seasonal level or platoons or like pitching usage patterns, and just looking at those like outcomes of individual at bats. Now today, thanks to the technology that is so readily available, but particularly is promoted by MLB.com itself, we can go pitch by pitch and like look at like how what level of detail of like the likely outcomes of these pitches, execution on individual pitches or fielding plays, maximizing strength, like how a guy like swings his bat. And the interesting observer's paradox, in a sense of like having discovered all of these things were measurable, is that the players have, and coaches of course have learned that you can change the outcomes and change what you're trying to do as a player.
That is amazing. So when you look at all of these details and all of these statistics, how do you tie them back to history and to a person? And how do you personalize that information in your work?
Okay. Well, we were starting from measurable like outcomes of what we might call discrete events, individual at bats, or individual innings or individual games, and looking at those kinds of outcomes that are you know not just historically recorded back into the 19th century, but observable, and we can get into evaluating player performance on that level. But now, today, thanks to all of the awesome like video and data-driven like mapping tools, we can get into individual pitches, individual fielding plays, individual outcomes on a level of granularity previously like you would dare to dream it, but you wouldn't necessarily think that you could get there. So today, not only is it having an impact on where players play on the field and position themselves, but it also gets into like this observer's paradox of batters now like understand like their swing paths in a much more on a much more diagnostic level, so that they can effectively change who they are as players and change the outcomes. And so, you know, just because this might have started out from initially an initiative to measure player performance, whether you're working in a baseball front office or a journalist or a data journalist who wants to know this stuff, the players themselves are using this as a diagnostic tool to improve their performance and change everything. And since one of the fundamental things that's awesome about history or journalism is you're talking about human agency, I love watching players reinvent themselves and become different and do different things and challenge themselves in new ways. And so, and those end up being stories you get to tell. So, you know, data informing better choices. We like to say that you would do that about like whether you were buying a house or a stereo, but making better choices in your career, making better choices in the moment as a player. I think it's all interconnected and a lot of fun, and a representation of where we are as a society. We get to do these things and figure these things out. As a journalist, I find it, like I find it fascinating because you can see what the numbers tell you and what it tells you about like what a guy is doing differently, and that gives you the opportunity to ask a better question in terms of interviewing. And it's like you're not just going up to him and saying like, wow, like you're hitting pretty good, like what are you doing and it's like instead what he's doing differently, and you want to talk to him about like how. And so like for instance, when I was still a reporter, I got to like I did a story with I particularly love the hard cases of like guys doing something radically different, and outside of their comfort zone. So like um, Mike Moustakas, when he was with the Royals, as a left-handed hitter, had a lot of problems with hitting left-handed pitchers. And he took a year and a half of working hard to change what he tried to do against left-handed pitchers, and in terms of how he would make contact and where he would try to hit a pitch, and knowing what they were trying to do. And so like essentially he was barreling up on outside stuff, from left-handed pitchers, knowing that the defense was shifting to the other side of the infield. He was going to try to hit the ball with authority against the shift, not into the shift, but to the left side of the infield and basically to where nobody was standing and do something that people didn't expect of him, but also being able to do it and execute it well. And forced them to throw him the pitches that he really wanted to see, which was inside, so that he could pull it and hit it to the right, hit it to right, and hit it a long way and hit home runs. But that he needed to sell them on the idea that he could do this other thing to force them to do the thing he wanted them to do. And so the amount of intelligence it takes to apply himself to do that, finding a hitting coach, in this case Dale Swaim, who would work with him on it and say, like, I may already be a successful player at the highest level, but I can be better and I can do this thing that I can't do. And so the data tells you what he's trying to do, and it shows you the outcomes of how it's playing out over time and how he's getting better at it. But then you get into, and that just gives you the information to ask really much more interesting questions and get into the stuff that he really, one, he knows about all of this stuff. He may not necessarily tell you unless you ask him, and you have to ask smart questions. So if you have the data that's informing the kind of questions you're going to ask, you can end up having a great conversation. So Mike Moustakas is talking about hitting and what he's trying to do differently and how he did it and what kind of work he put in. That ends up being a great story and tells you something both about the player and about how serious. He doesn't just go up there and swing the bat. This guy has spent a lot of his adult life thinking about how he does what he does. And, not just because it's his livelihood, but because of his investment in his craft and his investment in his own personal excellence. So that's fun and interesting stuff. But and similarly, like a story I did on like Tim Lincecum when he was trying to be the best possible pitcher he could be with at the end of his career with not very dominating stuff and basically trying to reinvent himself as a pitcher on the mound. And it's like, understanding that he's going to be behind in a lot of counts. And like, yet how does he generate bad contact? How does he generate a hitter jumping on a pitch that might have looked like the pitch the hitter wanted, but ends up being just that little bit taken off that helps him actually get like weak contact and bad outcome for the hitter. Again, I love uh, athletes aren't dumb. They're very, very smart about like what they know and what they do. And so it's like learning how to teach yourself as a historian or as a journalist, teaching yourself how to talk to them about the things they can tell you, because they can tell you a lot if you know what you're talking about and you know the questions to ask that let them, because again, I mean, speaking as a woman, like get a man talking about himself and about what he does, they'll talk forever. So how do you get them in that happy spot where they're going to talk about themselves? You ask him about what he does and how he does it. And as a journalist, you want to get them talking about the things they know and love.
Fabulous. So, honestly, I could ask you about this stuff forever, but this is a gaming podcast, and you are also quite the avid wargamer. We are on the Zenobia board together. For you, what is the connection between the work you're doing in sports and the the world of gaming, and particularly historical and wargaming?
Well, with baseball, there's an easy connection. And particularly like one of the other things that I spent my time at the University of Chicago doing while avoiding my coursework was playing Stratomatic baseball, and with a bunch of people in my dorm who also love baseball, and so like playing with the cards, like again, dice, cards, games, like playing leagues, like spending hours and hours on drafts and different leagues and different replays and getting new card sets and just going to town on that. Um, Not only was that something you would do all year round and a lot of fun, but again, as a gaming experience, and again, this is me, I love the visceral feeling of gaming. I love the dice. I love, I want the mano a mano, like, face to face, you know, aspect of it of like, because part of that is that it reproduces like if you're a manager in a major league dugout, you see what the other guy is doing and what he's trying to do, who he's warming up, who he's going to use. You know his range of options and you know yours, and you're trying to get maximum benefit and advantage. I want, like you don't get that digitally, I guess, in the same way. Whereas, like playing across the table from someone, you absolutely get that. And you want that impact. You want to be able to, like, you know, I don't want to say, like, see your opponent crushed and, like, disappointed by defeat, but you enjoy it. And in the same way, like, you with the agony of being defeated and, like, sitting there and, like, feel it again, it's like it's way more fun when you're playing with other people in person. And so, like, all of that stuff, um and that enjoyment of it is just fundamental. And part of this is also, like, my interest in historical gaming, um goes back to my childhood, where uh, my best friend, like a couple of doors down, he was also into gaming. And so, like, we were, this is again back in the 70s and early 80s, like, picking up games that, from SPI or Avalon Hill, Freedom in the Galaxy, seeing what people were doing with science fiction games, what people were doing, like, with fantasy games on board, not just D&D, because we also played D&D, and so that was always, like, RPGs were a part of it. And then, of course, once we started moving into, not just Atari or ColecoVision or any stuff like that, but playing actual games on Commodores and TRS-80s and whatever else. All of that was fun. And so, like, where they were playing, I don't even remember the name of the space conquest game, but where the neutral non-player character enemy always had Fleet Admiral Bozo attacking you, and so the name of the character was Fleet Admiral Bozo, and so you were Fleet Admiral whoever, like whoever you named yourself, but then you would get Fleet Admiral Bozo is attacking you with 60 ships, and it's like, oh my god. Well, and it's like, so I'm always going to have a warm spot in my heart for Fleet Admiral Bozo turning up at the worst times, but there were other games that, like, again, were really creative at the time. And I know, particularly when you talk about digital gaming. But the other thing that I loved was, co-opetition games like Mule, which came about in the early 80s. And so before, this was it was a revolutionary game because it wasn't conflict. It was about colonization of a planet, and you were competing against other colonists, but you could also help each other. And the designer of that game, Danny Bunton, that game is kind of singled out as being kind of the original, the route in which other co-opetition kind of games or games like The Sims came from, where it's like you don't always have to blow something up, and you don't always have to kill people. You don't have to be how do people talk about D&D? You're not always murder hobos. Um, that you're going out and you're doing something that might be more constructive and kind of fun to do together. And again, that was kind of going back to the early 80s. That was kind of revolutionary and fun and a different way to think about gaming. So, um, but I played a lot of war games, and I still have war games, and I still play them. But I mean, in the same way, today I'm more interested in games that are not simply war games, or I'm interested in, like dungeon crawlers that are kind of fun in their own way, or hit on particular themes. Like I can't help but love World of Smog, because who doesn't love steampunk? Well, I mean, some people who have no taste, obviously, but steampunk, but also one against many. So, like, you can play the baddies, or you can be a team of good guys, and you know, all- and especially with the expansions, the variety of flavors of fun you can have with that. Again, it gets into, it's way cooler than just D&D was back in the day, and it's also way cooler because it gets beyond, like, you can choose a number of female characters. You don't have to just, like, be Thor, or Conan or whatever. That you get some variety, and in addition, you get a variety of skills, and it's kind of better in terms of representation, but it's also just plain old more fun. And, an opportunity, I think, also, it's a matter of design of inviting more people in.
So I really was. I love what you said about getting more information about sports and about playing the better as a way of asking better questions and getting a better story. How can we apply that same strategy to games? Asking better questions with them, getting a deeper experience out of them.
Well, I think that's, like, I think that's where what is what is the point of the game experience essentially? And that's where one of the reasons why I'm not interested in um, a lot of war games, which just are like piling on big stacks and looking for your 3-to-1. It's like it's a math problem, and if I wanted to just play around with math problems, um, I'd be playing Sudoku by myself or something. Like it's nice, but it's not really what I'm interested in, particularly in the intersection of history and gaming. And so I'm more interested in um, the simulation value, that whether or not this is more than just a game, does it teach me something about the period? And does it make me think about some of the challenges that this game is supposed to be representing? So when I think of like, uh, a good game that gets into that. And ultimately, I actually just sold off my copy because it was also kind of agonizing to kick around. But like Freedom the Underground Railroad, where uh, that was a great way of getting into the subject of slavery and the expansion of slavery, or the expanding power of slavery in the United States in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. Did the subject extremely well. Uh, but ultimately, you as the player, like you're trying to get people to Canada, and you're not going to get all of the people to Canada. You're not always going to win, and it's like emotionally, the idea that a game would have that kind of emotional impact and can just literally break your heart, where you're like when you're thinking about what you're doing in this game. Um, on the one hand, it teaches you about the people who did run the Underground Railroad. It teaches you about the different roles people played and how they helped. And that can teach you about, like, perhaps thinking about yourself as a citizen and what you're going to do in life when confronted with particular injustices, but also, think about your country's history, all of which I think is positive and productive, but also which, like, given the subject matter, also can't help but break your heart. Um, but also, I think dealt with it in a very, because compare that to, I'm forgetting the name of the game off the top of my head, but the game that Hollenspiele just did. Yes, This Guilty Land, where, like, I personally, I have no interest in playing the power, like, slaveocracy politically, or and achieving the sustaining slavery in this country's history. I'm not interested in that. Maybe I don't want to play that. I understand there are people who just feel it's just a game and are comfortable with that. I think that This Guilty Land gets into it in a way that, again, I think is tough but fair. But I know I wouldn't want to play that game a lot because of the way it deals with it. But I also understand that there's a lot to be learned from how it does. Um, but that kind of impact in a gaming experience is really kind of like, it expands our ability to talk about these subjects. It expands our knowledge of these subjects. It's not just go read a book. It's about, like, wrestle with some of the with the
Right.
issues involved. And games that challenge you to do that and think about it, um, I do want to see more of those. And so that's part of the reason why I'm involved with Zenobia, but also because I want games that don't just package history as fight me, uh, you know, exercises. It's more about people making tough choices, people wrestling with um, existential challenges, and people and making big decisions. And so that's where history should provide people with examples of how other people have dealt with these challenges, and can inform you about how you should think about the world you live in present. And so that's where uh I guess the recent controversy of oh, I forget what it was called. But GMT was going to do an Africa exploration game that was strictly from the perspective of, the colonizing powers, and was not going to look at the experiences from, say, the empire of of Ethiopia. Like, they have the, you don't get to play Menelik and fight off like, the Italians. You only get to play the Italians. Um, that just not only did that strike me as like, look, this is a war that, that if you're going to look at Africa as a subject in the 19th century, you can't just talk about the colonial powers. You also have to get into um, some really, I mean, not just some dark subject matter, but like literally some, like the evil of the Congo Free State and what uh, the Belgians did, but what Leopold did. And not just slavery as an issue, but also that people were fighting
Mhm.
for their freedom. And really, if you're not giving players an opportunity to consider that side of the proposition, that people, that the people of Africa were not just waiting to be colonized, that they did want their own, they did not submit to that gladly. If you don't get into that, uh, you're doing the history of people a massive injustice, and you're just basically like creating this question of like agency, that like who has authority over their own lives. And it's basically, if you're going to tell me that a game about a bunch of uh, white dudes with guns have all the agency, that's not a game that's very interesting to me. And it's also not true to what happened in terms of what happened in Africa then, uh, and what's happening in the world today. And it's also not something that's going to reach like the best possible audience. And if you want to teach history, uh, or the widest possible audience, I think, if you want to teach history, you want to teach history to everybody, and you want to teach how it relates to all of them equally. And so that's where you have to be honest about everybody who was participating and everybody that was involved in historical events, and not just um, give agency to one particular kind of person.
So, like me, you agreed to be on the board for the Zenobia Award. What are your highest hopes for the project and what could come of it?
Ah, selfishly, I would say I want some really cool games, or I want to see some really cool games. And I think we've seen from some of the, we're already seeing that. I mean, in terms of the breadth of topics, which I think, again, reflect the diversity of the applicants themselves, where these are subjects that not everybody would have thought of as a subject for a game. And so the content itself, or the subject matter itself of these individual designs, uh, go way further, and that's because we're asking, you know, for anybody, like, like we're asking a broader group of people, like what do you want to see a game about, and what do you want to design a game about? And so, like, right off the bat, whether it's historical subjects that nobody else thought of doing, or because, like, say they're a 60-year-old white dude who never took a class on East Asian history, hadn't even thought about doing a you know historical game about China or something like that. So as a simulation, I'm really interested in that, because it's like this is territory that has not been covered frequently or well. For a Looking at it from the perspective of the designers themselves and their perspectives on these aspects of history, they're going to be asking different questions, because they're coming at these historical events from a different perspective. And so they're what they want to see out of a simulation, and essentially the challenges themselves, for, like, who are you as the player? What are you trying to achieve? I know that's 30,000 foot up stuff, but it's kind of like, that one of the games, like right now under consideration, gets into, like, you're essentially, you're a woman in a Middle Eastern city from, a couple of, like, from over 1,000 years ago. And so, like, what are you trying to do to survive and make it, as a business person? Like, how are you putting food on the table? And and I love that. It's just like, I hadn't thought about that as a game. And it's like, doing home industry again, this it, it's a reflection of where we come from in American society, that we've kind of positioned this. We have grown up with the after effects of this phony ideal of, that women at home in the post World War II environment didn't have to work and weren't sources of income and didn't have their own home industries and home businesses, and could just be stay at home moms. And it's like, one, I don't believe in there just being just a stay at home mom as a idea, but also, when you look at the history of women across multiple societies, they're busy doing shit. They're, whether it's running their own cottage industries or like finding, just because, like, uh, a husband might be a farmer, like, that doesn't mean that his wife is a stay at home or only just working on the farm. And so getting into the decisions people have to make to sustain themselves and their lives in different periods of history, and how that is a these activities aren't necessarily just gendered, but also that there are options open, that women have agency in history as well as men and can essentially do different things. And so, like, as a gamer in the 21st century, I wanted games that, like, will give me a window into historical experience that transcends just fight me kind of narratives, that get into how people live and what they have to deal with.
I want to touch on something. I think it's so cool that you've been able to essentially make a career that is dedicated to play. I think one of the phrases that we use all the time about both, when your kid loses a sports game, you say, "Oh, it's just a game," or even now when we want to kind of downplay the political importance of games that we play. Oh, it's just a game. It's just a game. Um, What is your perspective on the importance of play in human life and what it can give us beyond being just play?
It's about, essentially, it's social. I mean, fundamentally, it's about people playing with each other and the relationships you get out of play. I mean, essentially, it's human contact, and I think that that's probably more important now than ever, as a vehicle for making connections. And not only, like, whether you're talking about um, athletics, and sports in terms of like interaction in meat space, so to speak, but also it's about, like, just camaraderie, competition, the most fundamental human activity, being able to do that with groups of people, whether you're doing that across a board or digitally, in multiplayer games online. uh, it's fundamentally, it's a social activity, and it's about enjoying each other's company, and especially maybe in the anomie or the ennui of 21st century or American society, where, pandemic or not, sitting at home and playing games, or sitting at home in whatever suburb and being able to so easily isolate each other. Games give us the opportunity not only to make connections and interact with other people, uh, they give us the opportunity to just play and do that in a way that, um, I mean, I think we could get into a much larger conversation about socialization and learning how to interact with others. But, if you're playing with other people, you'll learn how to interact with other people. And, that's kind of basic. And so, and it's in a more of a between equals. And one of the things that gaming does, particularly as an experience, is equals can be across ages, across genders, across all ranges of experiences. But and so, wargaming perhaps being a bad example of this, but you get to meet people who are different than you are. And you get to interact with them and learn from the people you're gaming with. And in addition to having a good time. So, like, when you look at if the medium is gaming and the outcome is making friends or having fun, then yeah, we should all be signing up for that.
And I think what you're saying really underscores the point that it is really crucial to make wargaming a more inclusive space, not just because of the historical aspect of, oh, we can have ask more interesting questions with our games, we can learn more from our games, but also because you're missing out on a large chunk of the connections that you can make, the the affection that you can have for others, if you're not inviting a lot of other people to your table, you're actually cutting off, I think, a lot of your potential social experience.
Yeah, not only for yourself as a person, but also, I mean, again, I mean, I think this is also, I know some people poo-poo the notion, figuring that whether or not there's a generational crisis in wargaming, uh, because we've seen other people were saying this stuff in the early '90s, say uh, that video gaming was going to kill off um, board games or war games, and it's like no, in a sense. I mean, and I say no, not just on a for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of them, of course, being some of us are always going to be into the tactile feel of gaming. Some of it, we're always going to love our minis, our dice, our boards. We love the stuff, and we love that as a medium of interaction. Because how can you not? And whether that's because it appeals to our inner child or because it's just cool to have this stuff, we love that. But also because I think the value of the medium itself as a social vehicle is something that where wargaming, I think, needs to reach out. It needs to escape, I think, some of the it needs to expand upon some of the well-worn paths. And I think the ways in which some war games have been reinvented or kind of challenged themselves, and some designers are challenging themselves. Um, I think of like recently. We've seen some really interesting things happen in wargaming that in terms of design ideas, whether you want to talk about like card driven or card assisted action, but also like people who are kind of getting into bigger picture designs, like Cataclysm is, like I don't have. I used to be more interested in World War II and World War II games. I'm less interested in it now. But a game like Cataclysm, um, because of what it does in the broad strokes and with a certain elegance, kind of, like gets outside of, like the simply mathy exercise of so many war games and really kind of looks at broad strategic geopolitical issues, but also assigns um, historical culpability in a way that is, again, I think far more interesting than, just a pile of counters and shoving one pile of counters and another pile of counters to look for your 3-to-1 attack and get that hex. I mean, like I said, I am more interested in the broad strokes, historical consequences and historical actions, and less interested in the math.
Makes sense. All right. So, first, I really appreciate you coming on here. So, I'm going to ask you a couple softball questions on the way out. First, have you played baseball highlights and do you like it?
I have not, so you got to tell me something about it.
So, Baseball Highlights 2045, I believe, is a game that reimagines baseball, but in a world where there are cyborgs and robots that are playing the game. So, you have players who are naturals, players who are cyborgs, so somebody might have an enhanced pitching arm or something, and then actual like bots. And it's a deck building game where you are building up your deck and you basically are playing cards that can either, instead of having innings, it's like everybody's running and messing up the other person at the same time. So you can stop somebody's base run or you can try to advance your own base runs and they'll play a card that goes against you.
Oh, see, that sounds fun. I mean, and it's almost kind of, I mean, I don't know. That just reminds me of a game from my childhood, Slapshot, which I loved way more than I should have, but was a hockey game, and I don't know jack about hockey, but again, it was about mixing and matching and trying to build up the best possible lineup and be not a complicated game by any stretch, but the idea of like, doing it as a card game and one where a deck building game, that would be a lot of fun. So now I got to check that out.
Yes, if we lived closer and there weren't a global pandemic, I would say come over because I love it. I love that game so much. But what are you playing right now for fun?
Right now I'm actually trying to get into, and I should, I mean, maybe I shouldn't frame it that way, but the one game like I keep chewing on, and because I just love the depth, is Clash of Monarchs. Mostly because I love the 18th century, but also just because the multi-layered approach to um, strategy in the age of Frederick the Great is always going to be interesting. Not least because there were also powerful women like Maria Theresa or Tsarina Elizabeth. So, it wasn't just all, it wasn't a sausage party. Um, as far as people calling the shots, so that's always going to be of interest. But the other game that I'm trying to grok, and I haven't played with anybody, and I just want to learn it and get used to it. And because again, it goes back to one of my childhood favorites. Like I loved Freedom in the Galaxy as a kid, and that was impossible basically to play all the way to the end, and it was also kind of impossible to win as the Rebels. But now I'm like, I've got a copy of Star Wars Rebellion, and I mean, again, because although I work for ESPN, so this isn't about like promoting Star Wars, but I do love Star Wars. Uh, how could I not at my age? But also just love Star Wars. So looking at Star Wars Rebellion, and also because Rogue One, I think, is like the best Star Wars movie since the original Star Wars, frankly. So also getting the expansion and just trying to figure out like, so how does this all work together, and how could I play this? And because this would be fun, and that's where like again, whether with or without the expansion, but just again the idea that saving the universe and doing it in some place as familiar as the Star Wars universe and having fun with all of that. Um, and perhaps setting aside, yeah, okay, so as the Empire I really am blowing up the planet and killing millions of people, and that's an atrocity, but on the other hand it's Star Wars, so like I can feel a little more casual about it and enjoy it.
And if people want to find you online, where's the best place to do it?
Probably, as much as I hate Twitter, I'd say easiest place to find me socially would be out there on Twitter at what you call ampersand Christina Kahrl. But the other places you'll find me are usually in my Discord groups, where I love talking to other gamers, both in the Zenobia group, but also with a bunch of friends who we call it column shift left, who are like refugees from constant world and who love still talking about gaming and wargaming and other things. But then the other place where I spend a lot of time is Board Game Geek, because I have a lot of community there. And whether it's talking to other women, talking to other LGBT folks who love to game, talking about games, and also talking about subjects beyond gaming with people there. I'm one of the moderators for the for the Religion, Sports, and Politics Guild at BGG. And so, although it is known for being a den of how best a hive of villainy and scum, it very much is that on some level. But it is also, there are a lot of really great people who, like even across our disagreements or differences, can have some fun conversations that also sometimes wind up just being conversations about gaming.
And what's your BGG handle?
Diamond Self. So Diamond, the full word, and then Self, Sylph.
All right. And then, of course, I can be found anywhere on the internet as Beyond Solitaire. So reach out to either if you have questions. Christina, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. This is a delight.
This is way cool. It's been a lot of fun. And we didn't even get into our shared history on spending time at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which you will have to regale folks with at some other time, perhaps. But suffice to say, sharing that bizarre and fun place, I can't even begin to describe how much fun it was.
Yes, we both have had stints working and studying at a place with a questionable name, the Oriental Institute, but an otherwise illustrious history. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and happy gaming.